For this next session, before we get into it, I would like to provide some evidence or share with you that I have frequently said this started out as a middle of the road conventional science and medicine working with the Food and Drug Administration, known as the FDA. And for me, it turned into what I call a spiritual journey. And before we get too far into it, in the past, at a complementary and alternative medicine, thank you, presentation in Las Vegas, I presented that type 1 and type 2 diabetes, which are major health conditions, are an example of accelerated aging. That type 1 diabetics, you start seeing deterioration of organ systems in the late 20s, early 30s. In type 2 diabetes, you start seeing it sometimes in the 40s and 50s, that in a somewhat healthy individual, you do not see these kind of chronic diseases associated with aging until they're over 50 and sometimes up to 70 or older. The first thing that really hit me was that in the plant kingdom, nutrient molecules are placed that our genetic code calls for those compounds or those molecules to be present and provided in the diet for the operation of cellular synthesis of bioactive compounds that conduct the biochemistry and physiology of life. I had never really recognized that this was provided in the plant kingdom for the animal kingdom, which human beings are a major part of. The next thing that really shook my intelligence was that the nucleic acids, or the DNA code in plants, is identical to the DNA that is in the animal kingdom or humans, which I had never read anywhere, and I won't go into the experiments that prove that this is true, that the 4 nucleic acids operate just exactly alike, and that you can take genes from the animal kingdom and insert them into the plant genome and grow up leafy plants like spinach or tobacco and actually extract the enzyme or the protein that the code in the human being gives the instructions for how to produce it in cellular synthesis. Well, now we will start out with a provision that is provided for us, that we will start out with the first slide on this presentation. Here you can see that the first paragraph restates what I was telling you as my introduction, except for one thing, that in this middle of the road science goal that I say became a spiritual journey, it became apparent that there is a greatest mystery that has faced human beings from beginning of time, that there is a creative, organizing, and designing power active in nature, in our universe, that is not of our human dimension. And it's, I would say, the biggest unanswered question that humans have ever faced. Now, I want to give you one more example of things that made me come to this conclusion. And it's the fact of what has been provided in seeds, beans, legumes, grass seeds, corn seeds, nuts, tree seeds, fruit seeds, all the garden seeds that is a basis that we should offer thanksgiving, because I will go into a little bit of what is provided into the seed for the next generation of that plant. This is an example that a seed has a biopolymer protective shield over it, that protects what's inside the seed from being too dry or too wet, too hot, too cold. It oftentimes stops fungi and other organisms from eating the food supply and embryo that's inside this little package. You can see it's split there, that inside you have the first miniature leaves of the embryo that is asleep, so to speak, and it has its parts. But most important is there's a little part of that embryo that will become the first root. And of course, I mentioned the first seeds. And inside the various seeds, there's a cotyledon. And the cotyledon is a food supply that's called the endoderm for that little sleeping embryo when it germinates. And very importantly, it provides the food supply for the little embryo to develop the first leaf and the first root. And then photosynthesis happens inside the leaf, and the chloroplasts there get energy from the sun in a very narrow band between green and blue that starts the transfer of energy to the planet Earth in various plants. And the biggest portion of them are one-cell plants in the ocean, but then you get into the forest and undeveloped areas. But the seed contains everything required for the next generation, and will maintain the food supply is even there and protected by the coat. Now, one of the important things about seeds is that if we eat the whole seed, that some of the protective benefits of the seed coat can be used to protect our cells from various stresses in life. And that's why if you look into nutrition, that it often points out how healthy it is to eat beans and other provisions that are in nature that were for the seed for the next generation, that we essentially piggyback with our nutrition. Now, if you stop and think about it, this is incredible provision by the creative, organizing, and designing power in the universe. You can ask, how did this come to be? And as I tried to convey, I have never had as much faith in the fact that there is a creative, organizing, and designing power in the universe. And the seed is just another example of what has been provided for us as human beings. Now, currently in the discussions in our society has been discussions of the hemp seed, because for decades it was against federal law to even import into the United States a hemp seed that could be germinated. And as you'll see, it's in the same species of marijuana, and there used to be a ban in all states of marijuana, and they just lumped hemp in with it because it has a trace of originally a trace of the THC that is a compound that influences the function of the brain. However, with selective breeding in the hemp industry, they have essentially eliminated where you can't even detect THC thing. In the seed, you'll find fatty acids that are in a healthy ratio that make up about 30% of the volume of a hemp seed. There are healthy proteins and amino acids that make up 25% of the volume of the seed cotyledons. That you can find vitamin E, potassium, phosphorus, sodium, magnesium, sulfur, calcium, iron, and importantly, zinc, which is not present in a lot of plant source food. You can find arginine, a very important amino acid that when it's in the diet, it's essential to make nitric oxide that causes capillary dilation so that nutrients and oxygen can get to cells, and with this dilation that waste products can be removed, that the hemp seed decreases blood pressure, headaches, decreases strokes, and decreases blood clots, and decreases the incidence of pulmonary emboli, which can be lethal. There is cysteine with a sulfur hydryl attachment to it, which is important in the synthesis of glutathione inside the cell, which we have another lecture to stress the importance of this. This is the rate limiting amino acid of the 3 amino acids that are needed to make glutathione. And that's important because glutathione takes care of 60% of the intracellular free radical and oxidative activity, primarily coming from the mitochondria that take sugars made in plants and transfer the energy and the bond of the sugar to ATP. And this produces, much like furnace in your house or the hot water heater, that they rust out. Well, that's caused by oxidative activity to cause rusting and free radical generation. So the glutathione and that amino acid being in hemp seed is very important. And so many seeds are health supporting. And one of the reasons I was interested in the hemp seed is because of the limitations of the federal laws on providing to the public and professionals any information about the power of more comprehensive nutrition to support good health. And the hemp industry had over 50 active political action committees that worked to change that federal law to allow hemp seed to be brought in. And when you see all these little shops that are offering hemp oil, this came from changing this federal law, and hopefully that these political action committees can be stimulated or active to change the law that in the United States that you can represent and only present to the public and professionals that FDA approved drugs can be used to treat, cure, or improve deviations from normal health, which is not true. And in fact, the preamble to the Dietary Supplement and Health and Education Act of 1994, in the preamble, which is not law, but just a statement of why the legislation was considered, the first paragraph in our paraphrase says that science and medicine has demonstrated or shown that more optimal nutrition is essential for good health, to prevent disease, and to restore health. Well, you might ask, what more would you ask of complete nutrition? Well, you would ask that it be included in the law, because in the labeling section of the law, it says that only a drug can improve abnormal health. Now, the reason hemp seed was banned is it's the same species of marijuana, but the tetrahydrocannabinol, which the THC that I mentioned, is in marijuana, but it's very low in the hemp seed. And in fact, over the years, the breeding of the hemp seeds have even reduced the amount to where you can't even detect it. But I had personally some real reservations and skepticism about CBD hemp oil having the health benefits many were representing. But I looked into the European literature because hemp seed oil was researched and made available in Europe long before in the United States. And it was shown in basic science in Europe that it reduces pain, soothes anxiety, is active in fighting chronic diseases and moving the biochemistry and physiology to the normal zone, that hemp seed can improve mood, reduce depression, prevent inflammatory arthritis, protect the immune system, balance metabolism, and even age and sleep disorders. And as I mentioned, it was in the European literature that I found this out. And one of the mechanisms in basic science is that the nervous system has little areas in the nervous system that a nerve can only go so far, and there's a neural synapse where the signal is passed on to the next nerve. And in the biochemical structure of the synapse, there are amino acids, fatty acids, and carbohydrate molecules that make this up. Well, the CBD oil binds to the fatty acid molecules that are in the synapse, and it blocks the pain signal flowing on up to the brain to be interpreted as pain. And so by this blockage, you result in no pain. And I've talked to individuals that have had some incredible benefits from this. And so I personally feel like that this is true. Now, pardon me. In the world of events, as the aloe acemannan, the active ingredient from aloe leaf gel, was made available through broad marketing. Up in Michigan, there was a group of diabetic youth that developed type 1 diabetes, and for some reason, their parents used a compound that or a dietary supplement that had the aloe acemannan in it. And these children apparently were what were called the honeymoon period, and they reversed their need for insulin. And in fact, it was reported that the doctors couldn't find any evidence of diabetes after taking the dietary supplementation that contained the aloe acetylated mannose or acemannan. Well, that was interesting. But then in another location, which is important, in Bear Creek, California, at a ski resort, they had a cluster of type 1 diabetic youth, and they too got on the dietary supplement with the aloe acemannan in it. And there was a reversion to the fact that they no longer needed insulin, and the doctors couldn't show any evidence of elevated glucose in their blood. And they said that the evidence of the diabetes is gone. Well, very important, we do not claim through nutrition to treat, cure, or mitigate any disease. All we do is provide to the code in the DNA or the genes in our cells that are up and down the 46 chromosomes that control cellular synthesis. We provide nutrient molecules that the genes in cellular synthesis can make compounds that move the biochemistry and physiology to the normal zone. Well, after these two events, I found out at a conference, there was a PhD individual from the University of San Antonio, Texas Medical Center, that was an expert on diabetes in mice that was caused by a Coxsackie virus. Now, it's not known whether the Coxsackie virus is what causes type 1 diabetes in humans, usually children and young adolescents. And as I mentioned before, this is a terrible condition, you start seeing deterioration of chronic disease in the late 20s and 30s from this type 1 diabetes, despite everything medicine tries to do to reduce the problems. Anyway, this researcher at San Antonio, working with Texas A&M School of Veterinary Medicine, did some very important mouse research and found out that if the little mice had aloe acemannan in their diet before they were exposed to the Coxsackie virus, they didn't develop elevated blood glucose, and they continued to make insulin from their beta cells in their pancreas. If the mouse were given the Coxsackie virus before this etiolated mannose, they developed the picture of diabetes 1, just like the children in Bear Creek and in Michigan. And then if you added to their diet after evidence of the mouse diabetes, it would revert back to their blood sugars would normalize and their insulin levels would come back. And in sections made after sacrifice of these mice, it was noted that in their pancreas, they were regenerating the islets of Langerhans with the cells there that make insulin. So there was beta cell regeneration in the pancreas of these mice, which strongly support in basic science what we had seen clinically in Michigan and in California. I was excited over this, and on one of my travels to lecture, I was set next to an expert in diabetes recognized worldwide, and I was telling him about this, and his question was, well, type 2 diabetes is much more frequent in older adults than, say, type 1 diabetes 1. There's at least 10 or more type 2 diabetics for every type 1. And he says this restoration of insulin and drop in the glucose is not all that important unless they lose weight. And over time, we found out that many of the type 2 diabetics, without trying for the first time in their life, lost 50 up to an individual in Minnesota that lost 150 pounds. He had weighed about 550 before he started adding the aloe acemannan to his diet. But we saw multiple type 2 diabetics that reduce their fat mass in their body, which according to this expert would be profoundly important in regard to nutritional benefits to optimize this in the diabetics. Now, a paper was published, and this is the title, The Effects of Nutraceutical Dietary Intervention in Diabetes Mellitus, a retrospective study. And you see the authors there. And of course, there was trying to provide some anecdotal cases to show in humans some of the benefits like we're beginning to see in basic science studies. And as we very carefully keep saying, we do not treat, cure, or mitigate disease. All we do is more optimal nutrition so that we don't break the Dietary Supplement Health and Education, or DSHEA Law of 94, which is very serious, because a company that, or any source that claims to use natural products or nutrition to improve health can be attacked by the Food and Drug Administration. So what we point out is that nutrition, more optimal, corrects deviations from normal, and that the cells are programmed with the DNA to try to find balance in the biochemistry, which the father of human physiology, Dr. Hans Selye, called this position homeostasis. So nutrition supports normal gene expression of biochemistry and physiology, and that we never mention that the CPT code of a disease, which is maintained by computer for all doctors' offices, clinics, and hospitals, that stands for Clinical Procedure and Treatment Code. We don't talk or use the terms of disease. Like we never say diabetes. We say an individual says, I have a problem with the management of glucose levels in my blood. And this causes symptoms, and they name off the symptoms. And that's saying a biomarker and symptoms, which are not a disease. And these biomarkers and these symptoms move to the normal zone when you provide the genes what they need to, in cellular synthesis, to make the bioactive compounds that move activities and amounts being produced in the body to the normal zone. And this is very important, and not only in the type 1 diabetics, but in the type 2 diabetics in regard to more comprehensive nutrition. Now, we have a case report here of early invention in insulin-dependent juvenile diabetes with dietary supplementation. You see the two authors that I showed you a reduction of the scientific poster that was presented in Las Vegas that was showing benefits like this paper will show you here, I believe, here in a minute. And of course, the question is, since this occurs in little clusters and epidemics, is there some virus similar to or related to, or even the Coxsackie virus, that has a propensity to destroy the beta cells in the pancreas that make insulin? And as I said before, the type 1 diabetics is primarily in children and adolescents, and it's only 5 to 10% of all diabetics. And the frequent symptoms, which are not the disease, that you can mention in communication is unrelenting thirst, frequent urination, always hungry. In the type 1, you have weight loss. In type 2, you have weight gain, which the expert said really anything you say you're doing for type 2 diabetics is not significant unless they do reduce their fat mass. The diabetics complain of fatigue, weakness, upper GI symptoms, dizziness, and we've got there in bold letters thrush, because in primary care physicians, if someone complains of menalia or yeast in the mouth, mucosa, nose, urinary tract, or the anal area, it is so common to have thrush that they almost immediately will start doing tests to determine if they're diabetic. Diabetics also have reduced rates of wound healing, and blurred vision is also very common. And in fact, this can progress to virtually legal blindness by a proliferation of capillaries in the retina of the eye, which are very fragile, and they bleed into the eye and destroy the vision from this high level of glucose. Children don't have normal development and can't participate in activities that are common with their peers. And as I've said before, there are early degenerative conditions associated with aging, and type 1 is the most severe, and type 2 is bad because you have a higher incidence in type 2 of heart attacks or coronary attacks, strokes, bad infections, amputations of toes, feet, legs. And then there is a condition that this affects the capillaries and arterioles of the kidneys, and you start having kidney failure in the 30s and 40s from accelerated narrowing of the blood vessels to the kidneys called atherosclerosis that is increased by type 2 diabetes. Now, here is a response of one of those papers that was published, and you can see the health problems to the left, recurrent or persistent infections, the candida infections, which we call thrush, mentioned before, changes in the vision, high blood pressure, complaints of the gastrointestinal tract. And the other thing you see in diabetics is it affects the nervous system, and they have numbness. They have burning pain, not infrequently, in the feet and lower extremities. And here you see the percent of the people that had these symptoms, like it was 34% had recurrent infections. Vision, 63% complained of that. That overall health sense of well-being was deteriorated in 100% of them. And by adding the improved nutrition, there was 100% benefit. This second column is the number of individuals that had these problems. And if you'll notice that vision was the highest number of all of these, except for overall a complaint of fatigue and no endurance and just feeling lousy. Now we have the third column is the number that improved, and the highest number that improved was the general health sense of wellness, followed by elimination of candida infections. And we have the percent improvement in the next to last column, which is 91% on infections, 60% on high blood pressure, 97% on general feeling of wellness. And then the statistical significance of this, which is high in all of these conditions. And this was the observed responses in 32 type 2 diabetics that had the nutritional intervention. This is not a controlled study with random assigned controls. This is just individuals that chose to add this to their diet and the benefits they got when they had type 2 diabetes with all the symptoms that we outlined before. Here is presenting this in a different style with graphics if you don't handle numbers well, and the incidence of improvement is in the striated thing, and the total number, as you can see on the left, which includes the black, is the amount of improvement from the bottom up. And so you can see that the benefits for candida infections and persistent infections healing in diabetics, not only type 1 and 2, particularly on the legs, which is the more distal blood circulation, you get non-healing breaks in the skin or ulcers. And by adding the dietary supplements that contain the aloe acemannan, it's incredible at the improved rate of healing. So this is the previous data presented in a graphic form. Now, here was a 6-month supervision of type 1 insulin-dependent diabetic youth on more comprehensive nutrition. And we have here the high scores of their glucose before dietary supplement in the first column. This was done in 1998. And if you'll notice that before breakfast, that the glucose was averaging, the highest was 416, and it averaged about 217. And of course, you would like to see them around, say 90 to a maximum of about 110. And before lunch, here you can see the highest scores were 543 and the average 293. And before dinner at the end of the day, the glucose is high was 586, the average of 303. And before going to bed at night, they were still high, all in this first column before dietary supplements. Then the second column is a month later, the same time of day. Notice the significant reduction in 4 weeks. And let's jump way over to the next to last column. After 6 months, the average that was 217 before breakfast was now 145, which is still high, but it's wonderful. That pre-lunch it was 117, and before dinner it was 155, and it before bedtime is 138. So the percent reductions were 31%, 61%, 49%, 42%. This is movement in the right directions. And we had people that over time, after they had taken this longer, the values got down to the normal zone. Now, the best example that we have was at Shepherd Air Force Base, where retired Air Force military were in a diabetic clinic. And there were 2 MD physicians there, one who had about 250 to 300 patients and believed dietary supplementation was a bunch of hooey, and all he used was drugs. Whereas the other physician had experiences that he knew that in diabetics that the data that I've shown you could be benefits. So in his clinic, he had 281 retired personnel, that is the test population. Now, these were all type 2 diabetic adults, retired, and there was a high incidence of obesity in these patients. And I make a comment there that I was shocked when I was medical director for Manna Relief Ministries that we were providing these dietary supplements to AIDS orphanages in Africa that their parents had died from AIDS, and the children, many of them had the HIV-1 virus and some didn't, but that we got emails from several wanting to know if we had any childhood formulations for obesity, which shocked me because I think of skin and bones children in the third world, particularly in Africa, but they said that so many sources by government and nonprofit, particularly religious groups, have sent food to Africa for the orphanages, but it's not balanced nutrition. It is primarily calories loaded food, and that obesity is a problem, and that even in teenagers, they were seeing probably pre-diabetic changes due to obesity, and that we should come up with something for obese children, even in the orphanage field, which was a real shock. And of balanced nutrition and how it supports normal gene expression. You don't just need calories, you need a broad selection of different types of food to provide to the genes the nutrient molecules that are required to make the bioactive compounds to move the biochemistry to the normal zone. And that's why I mentioned this, that's a good example of the importance of a more optimal nutrition. Then, of course, are common particularly in 50 or 60-year-old humans. The more comprehensive nutrition addresses the imbalance and deviation from normal biochemistry. And by providing these molecules, the genes are programmed to, much like thermostat on the wall. If it's the thermostat, if it's too hot, air conditioning turns on. Too cold, the heater turns on. Well, in the genes, they don't have a zone for comfort. They have, and it takes nutrient molecules to decrease the activity of biochemistry to move it to a healthy, normal zone. And that's why nutrition is so important and why it's so vital in the diabetics. Now, due to the Air Force policy, the diabetics at this Air Force base, to be able to pay for it through the military, they had to put together a compounding pharmacy that included not only the aloe oligosaccharide or acemannan, add in a little packet of omega-3 fatty acids and magnesium to say it's a compounded pharmaceutical test material. And as I told you before, we had a control population because the physician with an equal number of type 2 diabetics only used medication. And we had a 1 year of comparing these two groups, which is not a blinded, randomized study. And I might add that drugs approved by the FDA seldom, if ever, before the drug is approved, randomized, blinded clinical studies because it is so expensive. And the pharmaceutical companies have convinced medicine and FDA to follow biomarkers rather than the end results. And this is the reason that if you go to the federal site of the FDA, there are multiple drugs that were finally released, but when thousands of people took it, they found out that there were adverse events from these drugs, and they had to take them off the market because it's important about long-term benefits. And one of the things that I'm trying to stress here is that long-term, more optimal nutrition is safe beyond compare. It's effective because it supports the engineering and design of life that is coded in the DNA or genes that control the cellular synthesis to make bioactive molecules that are used in the biochemistry and physiology of life. Well, in this study up at the Air Force Base, they found out that daily finger stick and glucose levels dropped, as we had seen in some of the previous anecdotal reports. In diabetics, the glycosylated hemoglobin or hemoglobin A1C, I need to make a little explanation at this point that the stroma of the red cells made of protein acts as a surrogate marker for what the high glucose is doing to the endothelial cells in the capillaries, in the kidneys, in the eye, in the brain, in the heart, and in the feet and legs. And so you can't go around biopsying them, but you can draw blood and find out the rate at which glucose or sugar has been attaching to the stroma of the red cells. And this is like an onboard monitoring device. And this will tell you if you've had high glucose levels at peaks over the, say, the last month or 90 days. And if you have the baseline, maybe you don't have peaks, but it just continues to be high, but not in peaks. Well, this will increase the rate of which the glucose attaches to the protein in the cell that surrounds the red cell. and you can use this as a monitor. Well, it was reduced in these type 2 diabetics. There was reduction in cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. That L, as I say, stands for lethal cholesterol, whereas the HDL level, which is a different form of the cholesterol, the H stands for healthy. So if your HDLs are up and your LDLs are down, which we saw in this along with total cholesterol, that's healthy because it you have to have higher LDLs and lower HDLs to promote atherosclerosis or narrowing of the arteries that support the heart, the brain, and the tissues of the body, like the kidneys and the extremities. Those type 2 diabetics that were requiring insulin and oral agents, both of them were reduced because the blood sugar levels were down. And as the blood sugar levels go down, you use less insulin and less of the oral tablets. Weight reduction was documented in these patients without trying. And this is important because in type 2 diabetics, oftentimes doctors try to get them to go on diets, and oftentimes on a diet they gain weight. About to sneeze. Sorry. Pardon me. Anyway, weight reduction, which the expert that I met on the plane said was important. This was documented, and the blood pressures were reduced, and the amount of medications required were reduced. The complications from diabetes, particularly the infections that occur and hospitalizations, were reduced. And the cost of operating the diabetic clinic for those that had the dietary intervention. And incidentally, we didn't deny them any drugs that if they needed them, it's just with the dietary intervention, they reduced their need for drugs. And so in this 281 group that added the dietary intervention, as I mentioned previously, the cost was reduced 40%. It was estimated that over 75% of the 281 patients got these benefits that we left above. And it was documented in the study that those individuals that added to their diet regular exercise got even more improvements than those that had sedentary lifestyles and did not exercise. And the minimum amount of exercise that's generally recommended is 3 times a week, walking at least a mile at a moderate pace. The patients that went on the dietary supplement, addition to their management, reported more energy and a better quality of life. We wanted to get all this data and publish it, but the faculty member from the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine and I went through all kind of gymnastics required by the military to try to get access to the computer. And despite all our efforts, we were never able to get the data from the computer to put it in a journal, but the information that I presented to you was presented by the physician, medical doctor that had these 281 patients at a medical conference held in Houston, Texas. Now, this thing, the paper that I mentioned of the expert from the University of Texas Medical Center in San Antonio was Charles Gaunt, who happened to be a classmate in undergraduate university level. He went on and got his PhD, and together in this study that I mentioned, this is the title of the published paper, that the Coxsackie virus causes an inflammatory disease of the pancreas and heart in the mouse models, and that working with the University of Texas A&M veterinary physicians were able to show the benefits of aloe acemannan in the mice with the Coxsackie virus, and that they actually mirrored the benefits of the type 1 diabetics in Michigan and in California. And I might add that with these mice, they were given pure acemannan, whereas the humans not only had the acemannan, but other molecules that are low or absent in the diet of modern dietary supplementation. Now, I told you about the benefits in the mouse investigation before, that again, their insulin was being produced by the beta cells, and that they were protected if given the aloe acemannan before exposing them to the Coxsackie virus, and that if you exposed them to the Coxsackie virus and produced what would be comparable to human type 1 diabetes, and then gave them the aloe acemannan pure, that the beta cells were regenerated and that the insulin levels went down. And we eventually were able to show that in other studies that millions of adult stem cells are released from the bone marrow of an animal or a human when you take aloe acemannan, and these stem cells migrate into organs, like in the case of diabetes, the pancreas, and regenerate the important functional cells. It was very important that the honeymoon diabetic youth got responses clinically that there was no evidence of the diabetes, which is remarkably beneficial to these children, because the grave long-term benefits of type 1 diabetes, and of course this was mirrored in the older type 2 diabetics. But one has to be very cautious until more research is done. But this is not a new idea, as I have in previous lectures pointed out, way back as far as 5,000 years ago. In the Hebrew scriptures, they pointed out that the, quote, leaves of the trees shall be for either medication or healing. And in the New Testament, it says the leaves of the trees shall be for the healing of the nations. Well, this is the leaf of the desert lily, aloe. And as Dr. Bill McAnally, PhD, confronted me very early in 1985, that the leaf of the aloe is so useless in terms of just the leaf, that the jail has got to have something important in it for it to be mentioned so many times in the Hebrew scriptures and in the New Testament. And sure enough, with the 12 academic institutions doing the basic science research that the FDA required, and I might add that initially I told them I wouldn't get involved, that I wasn't qualified. I was a community pathologist. They needed to go to a medical school. But they leaned on me that they really didn't understand what the FDA was asking for in the language they used that has so much Greek and Latin in it. And then lo and behold, the reports that they got back from the institutions that they were paying to do what the FDA required, they didn't understand. So that was my primary job, was to translate medical and scientific terminology to these either lay or individuals that didn't have a medical education. And I was to try to predict from this basic science what this might be of benefit to humans if it were approved as an FDA drug. And I would be remiss in ending this if I did not point out that Carrington was thrown out of the FDA for two important reasons. One, no toxicity whatsoever could be shown with acute high levels or high levels chronically administered to animals and human beings at undergraduates at the University of Texas, getting 3,000 milligrams a day, and then sterile IV given into medical students in Houston. We showed no toxicity, and this is pharmaceutical heresy because the father of pharmacology, Paracelsus, most famous statement was, all drugs are poisons. The benefit depends on the dose. So at the FDA, you have to tell them the LD 50 and the LD 100, how much of whatever you've got does it take to kill half the animals and how much to kill all of them. And there must be a wide range between 50% and 100%, or they won't let you proceed to the second stage of drug approval. Well, our problem was, even though they would send us back, say, give more longer, we could not provide any toxicity. This is medical and drug heresy. The second thing that was a problem is through broad usage by people as a dietary supplement, that every deviation from normal, whether it was physical, mental, or emotional, had some degree of improvement. And the drug paradigm and medical paradigm is one drug, one disease, which I had never realized before. And in antibiotics, it can get to even more limited in that, depending on where the organism you get, you use different antibiotics. So we had 2 points that got Carrington thrown out of the FDA. Unfortunately, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act was passed in 1994, and we realized that the statement in the preamble to this law, which is not the law, but a statement of why the legislation was even considered, that more comprehensive nutrition supports good health, prevents disease, and is necessary to restore health. Well, this active ingredient that I've been sharing with you that is in the current dietary supplementation to be added to the diet, and I say to simplify it, it's like restoring to the diet what in a more agricultural time in our country, that nutrient molecules that used to be in the family garden and orchard, where you allowed the produce to mature on the plant so that the genes of the plant could put these nutrient molecules that our DNA requires in cellular synthesis into the produce. In this day, due to the green harvest, as I point out in the 1940s, you could only get just a lot of fruits and vegetables for about 4 to 6 weeks, because the grocery stores were owned by a local family and there were very few things beyond 50 miles offered. And it was only during the growth season that you could get some of these. But now, with the national grocery chains and agribusiness, you can get watermelon 12 months of the year. You can get raspberries, strawberries, blueberries, blackberries year round. How do they do this? They follow the growth zones across the country. And unfortunately, for shipping life and shelf life, they pick it green when the principal molecule in the produce is chlorophyll. It's before the genes in the plant, because when it begins to mature on the plant, the genes put the nutrient molecules provided in nature by the creative, organizing, designing power in the universe to put in the plant kingdom what we need for optimal health. And I have shown you how this very common Fact is, the World Health Organization calls diabetes as a silent epidemic. And there are far more people with diabetes than, say, Alzheimer's or AIDS or some of the other diseases of chronic disease. So that's the end of this lecture. I hope it means something to you.